So what do you tell people out there who are curious about Bitcoin, who's just a total newbie? What's Bitcoin and why are you so excited about it?
So there's actually this website that was just put together by some Stanford students called trybtc.com, and that's probably your best primer 101 in sort of learning about Bitcoin and how Bitcoin is very much like email for cash. And it also helps you set up with a wallet and all the basic steps to sort of get in without jumping in right into the deep end, which I think the panel was to some extent.
Yeah, it was not for the uninitiated, the panel, but there's so much resources online. Like there's great articles. There's a great article in the New Yorker. I think Fast Company's done a couple, and even Vice. So if you can find your way to Google and type in Bitcoin, there's a great amount of stuff out there that'll get you going.
Yeah, and you also said, well, someone on stage talked about the metaphors, that it helps to kind of think about it in terms of metaphors.
Right. Yeah, so like basically, HTTP protocol allowed mail to be sent electronically, so we now have email, which is decentralized, and so basically the promise of Bitcoin is similar to money, so the idea that you can have electronic money or voice over IP, you can use Skype relatively for free, and your voice goes over the internet as opposed to the infrastructure of AT&T, which is costly. So basically, it's just Bitcoin is not just a lot of people get caught up whether it's a commodity, a currency, but they sort of forget the fact that it's a technology platform, it's a protocol where money can be sent from here to Hong Kong and back instantly for free. So it's kind of like the promise of what the internet brought to mail, to phone calls, and now you have to money.
And speaking of being able to send this stuff anywhere very quickly, is there a geographic sort of headquarters for Bitcoin? I think that in normal finance, we think of New York, Zurich, these places. Is there a similar thing for Bitcoin?
In terms of like sort of the interest level, or I mean, the U.S. is obviously there's a lot of Bitcoiners in the U.S. China is also growing, but I think sort of down the road, what we're going to see is Bitcoin really taking off in the developing world, because as much as I think Bitcoin's probably not going to be as life-changing to somebody in the United States as it will be to someone who's literally unbanked, who has no access to that type of institution, and yet if we can give them a Bitcoin address, they are immediately banked and they can receive and send payments. And that's just that's like the cornerstone of prosperity, being able to sort of be banked, so to speak. And there's hundreds of millions of people around the world. There's, I think, 60 million people in the US alone who don't have bank accounts. So imagine if you're a farmer in India and you're trying to sort of send payments back and forth. And I think a great example is in Kenya, Vodafone created this private currency called M-Pesa. And so there's, I think, 30 plus million people basically trading value in airtime minutes. And that's a private created centralized currency. And without going too much into sort of potential drawbacks for that, Vodafone effectively controls that. Whereas Bitcoin is decentralized and there's no central authority to it. So you can imagine how Bitcoin could be used and potentially replace and be used in all kinds of places where there's no central government or the people really can't get banked.
Now, is this concept the reason why Satoshi, who's the original developer of Bitcoin, hasn't come forward and standing behind publicly as the individual who's behind this?
Well, the cornerstone of his philosophy was that you didn't have to trust anyone, including himself. The source code's open source, so everyone can look at it. And so I think that part of not knowing who he is plays into that, but I also think that definitely his invention, the person behind it, would definitely be subpoenaed, and it might not hear the end of it. So it's definitely, at least at the best, a gray area to invent a new currency or payment platform system. And I think when you learn more about him and all of the things, or whoever it may be, it could be a bunch of people, but let's just say he for the because it's Satoshi and he says he was a he, that he considered almost everything. When you look at hackers, crypto hackers who have tried to break the code, they're just humbled by the elegance of it, how every time they went down a path where they thought they were going to find this beautiful bug, it said basically like, turn around, go home, like, I've already thought of this. So he certainly had great reasons to be anonymous. The one that I find it intrigues me, and I think that it's great that we don't have to dwell on who's behind it, but rather, what it says, what it means.
Only the source code is really put on trial, not the individual, which would be a tremendous distraction from the actual invention and innovation and the promise. And I think that is a to have the foresight and understand that was probably the most likely outcome, I think was a very smart move. And there's also no, without knowing the founder, as investors, we don't know who the founder is. That's usually the first step we do, is we get on the phone and we say, hey, I'd like to learn more about your company. And then if it sort of progresses from there, you do in-person meeting and whatnot. There's no founder, there's no inside baseball, there's no inside knowledge, and you can't, a lot of the things we see today in Wall Street and the financial world, there's all this corruption, insider trading, that can't exist in Bitcoin, which is, I think, pretty cool.
And speaking of someone being put on trial, you mentioned briefly on stage that you've been subpoenaed along with a bunch of other people who are involved in Bitcoin and several of the companies in which you've invested. Are you the most public face, do you think, in the absence of Satoshi, which is, hasn't come forward as a person? You, as the biggest investors or biggest holders of Bitcoin, you are the ones who get put on trial or subpoenaed.
I think, so what we've felt is that the regulators want to learn more, and I think that's a good thing. I think that we are talking about a store of value here, and it's important for there to be like a healthy, thoughtful regulation. I think that's good for more people wanting to get involved in Bitcoin than it's good for Bitcoin. So the thing is, nobody knows more than anybody else. About our reasons for investing. We can do our research. We can, you can listen to panels. You can do it, but nobody has that crystal ball. There's not, like Cameron said, there's no such thing as insider trading in Bitcoin. There is if you buy, a share in a public company on exchange, because there are insiders and there are outsiders, people who know a lot more than other people. Whereas other than Satoshi knowing his own motivations fully, which he barely, he gives glimpses into, at this point, there's been people who have actually been handling the code more than he actually probably has.
Right.
So, there's the kimono is completely open here, and but I do, I think Cameron, I speak for Cameron as well, and a lot of other people that a healthy regulation is a good thing.
And I think we got a tweet about Wall Street from a viewer here. Bitcoin Revolution session is an eye-opener, built-in scripting to code financial services, liberation from Wall Street. Is that a reason why you think some regulators have been really focusing on this? Because this is making Wall Street it potentially could make Wall Street less powerful?
I don't think that's the case so much. I think it's really more of a word that seems to be used a lot is narco-terrorism. And I think that there's sort of also this prevailing belief that Bitcoin is very anonymous, and I think that's very overstated. The anonymity of Bitcoin, the blockchain is a public ledger, so by virtue, the transparency, it's incredibly transparent. So you can trace the first Bitcoin from the beginning of time and as it travels through the blockchain. And at some point, if you're going to try and do bad things with that Bitcoin, you have to find someone who's either willing to accept the Bitcoin, or you have to turn that Bitcoin into some sort of fiat currency. And at that point, that's when sort of the anonymity gets erased to some extent. So in my viewpoint, it seems KYC, know your customer, AML, anti-money laundering, those types of regulations, just as they apply to any financial services business or money services business, should and I think will be applied to Bitcoin. And I don't think that's a bad thing at all, because I think there's some uncertainty. Some people on the sidelines, whether investors, entrepreneurs, and banks, are unclear. Do we bank this Bitcoin company? Are we going to get in trouble? Are we going to basically disrupt our core business? And I think the more certainty we get, the more people are going to be like, okay, great, now I can go to work in the Bitcoin world. So I think, though, one thing I'd also point out is that the sort of the use case of Bitcoin, there's all this sort of, at least a year ago, there was all this talk about the dark web and Silk Road and this and that. Those use case scenarios are rapidly decreasing and becoming a very small minority of Bitcoin and why it's used and why people love it. And I think just like cash can be and has been used for illicit purposes, it doesn't sort of erase the huge value of having money and a currency in a system. So
what we're talking about here, like it's human behavior. Like humans do bad things or good things, and sometimes like cash or Bitcoin could facilitate that. But it's really, it should be regulated in a healthy way. But I think that at the end of the day, it's not Bitcoin or cash that does things that are bad, it's people.
Right, and you could say the same thing about the internet, as you've said, in its early days and continuing until now.
And to the point of the liberation, I mean, I think Bitcoin, because it's relatively frictionless, there's probably a lot of fees and things that we pay to certain institutions that we probably don't have to in the future. Similar to how Skype created sort of a much more affordable price point for long distance calls. And if you look at the way iTunes prices sort of generally almost always a la carte when you're buying one song, and you're not sort of forced into buying this album. Now, if it's like Pink Floyd's The Wall, maybe you're going to buy the whole album. But there's a lot of artists out there where you're interested in one or two songs, and it's a much fairer price point. And I think things like iTunes, innovations like that, or Skype, when it sort of has now leveled the playing field, so to speak. I think there's probably certain transactions and things where the fees are going to be much fairer price for the consumer.